Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are and when you are watching or listening. My name is Michiko Walcott, and I am the Principal Consultant at Insight Analytics, working with organizations on various types of sizes around the world and on data and analytics topics, on pretty much every topic except actually doing the analytics. This is a series of 30-minute, relatively informal Q&A sessions on various non-technical topics about data and analytics, somewhat motivated by the COVID-19 situation. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The session will be 30 minutes long. Please keep videos off, and you are all muted and won't be able to unmute just to make it easier to run a one-person show. If you have any questions you'd like addressed during the session, please enter them in the chat box, and they will come directly to me, and I'll do my best to address them in the time we have. This session is being recorded, and people who registered will get a link to the recording. Today's session is titled The Cornerstones of Enterprise Analytical Evolution. It is the fourth session in which we're addressing the various questions in the Ask Me Almost Anything series. It's intended for technical leaders of analytics, statistics, and data science, both current and future. If you missed the previous sessions, the recordings are available at Insight Analytics YouTube channel. As this is an introductory overview, we won't get into too much specifics, but hopefully this will help you reframe your approach to some of the other soft topics in analytics. And finally, for the purpose of these sessions, the terms analytics, statistics, and data science are all interchangeable. And I use the word analytics really just for the most part for the sake of simplicity. So this is a good session to tie it all together, all the foundational elements that we've discussed so far. We started this series with the centered around the idea of value generation from analytics and how that is even more urgent in the context of the economic slowdown from the COVID-19 crisis. Now, if the analytics we generate are not concretely associated with the business value as consumed by the business, then we have made ourselves a pure expense in the eyes of the enterprise. So the enterprise reduction, expense reduction, unfortunately, is a popular term in management during tough times. In fact, right now, there's been a study, and there is a study going on that tracks the analytics employment situation. I believe it's done by Birchworks and International Institute of Analytics. One is an analytics recruiting firm, and the other a research firm focused on analytics, both pretty well known. The latest update shows that less than half of the respondents report business as usual when it comes to analytics staffing and hiring, and the other half have had, or at least are considering, substantial impact in analytics employment, be it hiring freezes or downsizing or pay reduction. So as much as we want to claim that we produce value, we are not immune to being treated as expenses if the business cannot realize a value from what we produce. But the value problem is not new. We've seen the perpetual 60 to 70% failure rate that we hear about all the time. Now, this is really poor performance when you really think about it. At the personal level, if you didn't meet your job expectations 60 to 70% of the time, you wouldn't have a job. Just as a job, you wouldn't have one. And it's just that somehow we've been able to survive this. I don't know, maybe because so far analytics has been novel and maybe even sexy enough. Well, that may change as the slowdown continues. So we have to change the way we view our place in the world. We talked about so far what is essentially a framework for an enterprise collaboration process and its interpretation, if you will, to help close the value gaps within that process. Then in the last session, we focused on looking at generating insights through the lens of a consumer. Now, we don't normally think of information as something to be consumed, but that we don't often creates a gap. This is a big reason why we keep producing consumables, which are not being really consumed like the notorious models that sit on the shelves. Now, we hear so many stories about how many models just sit on the shelves. Now, we tend to look at what we do as a part of an information supply chain with a series of handoffs rather than taking a more holistic value-centric view. The analogy we looked at was cookie making. And I like this analogy because most of us like cookies. And even if you don't, you can appreciate them. I certainly like cookies. So data, analytics, technology, and business are analogous to the ingredients, the recipes, appliances or environment, and the consumer. And functionally speaking, our role and expertise is the development of the recipes for these insight cookies. So when it comes to generating insights in this value stream, the differences between the roles are in the objectives and in the focuses of the roles, and less in the hard skills than we would like to think. So the enterprise processes and functional roles need to align with this value stream, just like for any other consumer products. Now, I'm not going to rehash all the details because that would make this a 2-hour session. But as soon as I start talking about roles and responsibilities, invariably the next question is, well, what should the org structure look like for these roles and responsibilities? So I wanted to start the answer to this question by saying first that this is a lot more about functional roles and ownerships rather than reporting structures, at least not initially. For one thing, a lot of organizations can't just restructure. In some cases, like public sector organizations, it's essentially impossible to do any kind of large-scale org changes. Or if your enterprise or environment, if you would, may be across multiple organizations, in that case, you don't have the basis to do anything in the other organizations involved. I mean, you just don't have the right to change the structure or anything, much of anything for that matter, of another organization. And also, with the way that the technology and analytics are changing today so rapidly, putting in a formal reporting structure too early can make you just too inflexible. In reality, what happens in more successful cases and more successful enterprises is that the roles and ownerships get defined and implemented first and even practiced for a good amount of time. Then later, there's enough of a case to match the reporting structure to what's going on, to how things are actually working. And so it happens like we are realigning the organization to the way we already operate today. And restructuring like that comes at no surprise to anyone anyways. So for that reason, think of this as a functional operational governance structure. Well, that's a mouthful. Or perhaps a little bit simpler, an accountability and collaboration framework rather than a formal reporting structure. We can always fix the reporting structure later. So what is this structure? We have various layers. At the top, someone or someones will need to make sure that everything is aligned at the enterprise level to the strategies, to visions, to each other, etc. Then you have the functional owners of the data, analytics, and technology. That's where the buck stops there with respect to those areas or functions. Then there is a layer of working groups for each area. Now, they are not necessarily 3 separate working groups, by the way, but rather it's just an illustration of the focus and of the accountability structure. Then there is a layer of the day-to-day stewards, quote unquote, for each area. And these are the people who make sure that the things happen as they are intended. And some of them may actually wear multiple hats across areas, and that's okay. Then the last but not the least, by any stretch of imagination, there is the foundation that is of the business needs. So in a way, the structure is held together between the executive leadership and the business like a sandwich. And you have to have a good mechanism for communicating both up and down and everything in between. Now, not necessarily a formal mechanism for communication, but an effective one. And the challenge with formal mechanisms is that they can they can turn quite bureaucratic if the heart is not in the right place for everybody involved. So that gets a little bit tricky sometimes. And actually, as far as the org structure is concerned, this is about all there is to it. We don't want to complicate this either. Now, too often organizations start with way too much detail, which then become just a set of tasks to be complied with. And this is a perfect recipe for bureaucracy. It slows things down, it actually creates conflicts, and generally makes our lives just a lot more miserable. So the most important thing is to define and agree on ownership, who the stakeholders and participants are at each level, and maybe a one-page mini charter to document the agreement, then just go at it. That's it. You don't even need any specific series of recurring meetings. We all love meetings, right? Standing meetings to address something like this can become bureaucratic pretty quickly. So maybe you'd have a meeting or two to brainstorm or talk it all out at the beginning. Then you can just acknowledge these roles, come to an agreement, and incorporate it in your activities that already exist or you are already planning to do. And all this obviously at the appropriate level, of course. Now, meeting dynamics tend to start breaking down at 6 to 8 participants, so that's always a consideration. And of course, we've all been in those meetings where the entire world is invited in the name of inclusion, but in the end, no one feels really included because you can't engage effectively. It's just too big. So now, once we have this working well for some time, then we might consider realigning the reporting structure to it. But that is not really strictly mandatory, again, at least not in the beginning. So the question that arises now is, well, isn't this just an extension of the data governance or information governance? Don't many organizations already have this implemented? Well, from what I can see, or what I can see, the one of the challenges I see all the time is that the definition of quote unquote governance is way too narrow. And so too often it is more about control and compliance rather than decision making. And the key to this functional structure is to focus on decision making and not on policing. It should provide a framework for collaboration and not become an excuse to police other people. That's tricky. Now, this is a little cliche in management consulting, but it serves the purpose as we think about the key elements needed for an enterprise or an environment to evolve toward analytics maturity and culture and innovation in general. I've already mentioned that analytics, culture, and innovation are quite closely related. We've covered the people element, so the roles, the responsibilities, the ownership, and the functional org structure. We've covered the process element, the enterprise process framework, and the information value stream. And now, I'm not interested in going into the technology aspect, the analytical techniques, the tools, and the standards, because you have all that covered much better than I ever could. So this is really everything outside of all of that, the doing analytics, the techniques, the, the, the cutting edge methodology and so forth. Now, whenever you suggest something that's a little bit outside of the norm of the comfort zone, the question is almost always, well, what's it going to cost? What's it going to cost to implement this? Well, it doesn't require an investment in the traditional sense. There's no tool, there's no software or hardware to purchase or deploy. There is effort and expertise required to define and implement the processes and the structures. And this includes good participation of all the stakeholders. That is really, really important, obviously. It's also important to note that you can actually do this poorly with net negative impacts and to the detriment. So then how do you do all this? Again, you as an analytics leader are not necessarily responsible for building this, but you are responsible for orchestrating towards it. So we focus so much on doing analytics that we neglect putting what we do in the context of what makes it valuable. Now, you do not need to be in upper management to make any of this happen, because leadership can and should occur at any level, and it's more important to be an influencer rather than be in a position of authority. And as I mentioned a few times, command by authority is practically dead in today's world anyways. So where do you start? On one hand, it's more specific at the day-to-day or project or activity level. And on the other, it's a broader, more organizational set of activities and initiatives. So on the day-to-day side, do value stream mapping. Now this may, some might of you guys may be familiar with the idea, some may not, but it's basically the idea of mapping the value of something throughout the process. So for each of your analytics activities or projects, go through the exercise with your stakeholders of mapping the value to be generated, be it predictive modeling, dashboarding, explanatory analytics, design study, A/B testing, attribution modeling, it doesn't really matter. If we're doing analytics, we want to do this. Now, this should happen no later than the beginning of the design step in the enterprise process, and definitely before you start doing the analysis. By the time you do the analysis, it's going to be a little too late, or you would have to backtrack a good bit if you happen to be wrong. So then you start from the end, and I mean really, really end. And that end is, what is the business or research decision to be made? We're not talking, this is not just a business or research question, but the decision itself. And this distinction is important because the trap that we fall into is that often the business or research question doesn't go far enough to connect us to the decision to be made. And it gives us a false sense of goal to be achieved. So as an example, if we're doing something with customer analytics, which customers are likely to churn, is indeed a business question, but it does not represent a decision to be made. It is just a knowledge exercise if you stop there. So that's fine in exploratory stages, because you want to understand, you want to gain more understanding towards something, but that it can't end there. They do not define our goals. Remember, decision is consumption for us. So we all have heard some variants of, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Well, but we're so focused often on measuring, that the act of measuring, that we don't spend enough effort clarifying what the it is. And we as statisticians and analytics professionals should know the importance of exact definitions. Cause and effect analysis or diagramming can be useful as a first step. to articulating the decision in question, or like fishbone diagram used in process improvement exercises. But the specific methodology itself isn't really all that important. Then understand who will be making this decision. Now, it is important to do this without any reference to data. This is really hard. I've run a number of facilitated sessions like this, and one of the hardest things to do for anyone is, even the business or researcher, is to articulate all this without mentioning words like data, model, analytics, metrics, score, and so forth. Basically, any word that has anything to do with what we actually do or produce, is because it's so easy to gravitate to, ooh, we can look at this data, before we can clearly articulate what we will be looking that data for. If I'm facilitating something like this, the illegal words will get you a penalty flag or a red card, depending on the most popular sport in that country. And the challenge is that really the reference data or methodology or particular analytical techniques really becomes kind of a shortcut, and we cheat ourselves from getting to the bottom of what we really need to know to get the value we're after. So then once we have the it clear, then we can address the question of how to measure or evidence it. And if your it is good, then this is often trivial. Now we have that, with that defined, we can work backwards into analytics from this decision. Now, I say backwards because if you start from analytics and map forward, you're kind of hoping, you're crossing your fingers to get to the decision, end up at the decisioning point. But if you start from the decision and work backwards, you are guaranteeing the lineage between the decision in question and what you do. You guarantee that the insights you generate will be directly traceable to consumption. And more often than we'd like, it turns out that the analytic you had in mind is not the analytic the business needs when you get right down to it. And if you can't back into analytics from the decision, then maybe this is not a question for analytics to solve, or you have a much bigger issue. So that's on a kind of a day-to-day project level, activity level side. On the organizational side, again, it doesn't mean that you have to be upper management to do this. Plenty of individual contributors are successful change agents. So first thing first, work to become an influencer if you're not one already. This is really more about how effectively you work with others, especially with people from other areas. Now, the very first thing after that, define the key enterprise values to be generated by analytics. This starts with defining the it now at the enterprise level. This may now stay somewhat conceptual in some cases, but you will have to go much further out than you think or you're used to. Then think about who your stakeholders are as you go around the wheel. Who are they? Where are they? Map them into each of the 4 functions. And if you can't identify the right stakeholders and their roles as you go around the wheel, then you have little chance of realizing that value from what you do. So work on those gaps. Number 3, start thinking about how the whole pushing and pulling that we talked about in some of the earlier sessions is working today around the wheel and where the challenges are. Now, remember that if we are in the position of having to do the pulling because the enterprise is not quite as mature, analytically speaking, then we have to be able to connect to the client or the business all the way back to well before the discover phase. Number 4, get your stakeholders on board that you need to do this to get the value out of analytics. Specifically, how this gets done will depend on each situation, but the key message is that not only do you want your enterprise to get maximum value out of analytics, but also that you want to make it easier for everybody to work with you. And finally, enlist someone who can help the enterprise do and plan what it needs to do the right way. because it is often done poorly. But when it does work and when the light bulb goes on, it is quite exciting and rewarding. So we are indeed coming up on the 30-minute mark, almost right on time. And I will look to respond to any of the remaining questions outside of the session. Please do send me any follow-up questions or any thoughts. And also, please send me your thoughts regarding any non-technical topics you would like to see covered that I might be able to address in the future. Now, I've been doing these sessions on Mondays, and today was a bit of a conclusion for the initial round of sessions. I'm going to pause next Monday. The Monday after that is a holiday in the US, so I'll be evaluating how to best provide useful content after that. Maybe doing something in a different format, I don't know. Haven't decided that yet. This has been a learning experience for myself personally, and it has helped me think through some of these ideas through the questions submitted. So you can find me on LinkedIn, you can find me on Twitter and on my website. And I would like to just thank you for your time and attention. Please have a great rest of the day and stay tuned for more in the future. Thanks.